Chicago doesn't always give you a heads up. Some mornings the wind just rips off Lake Michigan and cuts right through your coat before you've even stepped off the curb. You see the crosswalks packed with people who've already decided exactly how miserable their day is going to be. Heads down, coffee gripped like a lifeline, just another blur in the race to nowhere. It's that classic corporate trance where you're so buried in the grind that you stop seeing the city entirely. We've all been there, right? That version of ourselves that's crushing it on paper but can't remember the last time we actually looked up from a screen to see the people who actually matter. Ethan Walker had stopped noticing the world a long time ago. He moved through the streets the same way he handled a boardroom. Total efficiency and a quiet kind of authority that made people move out of his way without even knowing why. At 35, he'd already built the kind of life most people spend decades chasing. He had 3 acquisition firms and a portfolio that hit everything from logistics to biotech. His office on the 42nd floor had those floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that should have felt like winning. But most days, it just felt like being stuck in high altitude. He pushed open the door to the Starbucks on Michigan Avenue at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning. He didn't even need the caffeine. His assistant usually had a cup waiting for him 2 hours earlier. But the walk had become a ritual. It was the 1 hour a week when he wasn't answering to a soul. The line was backed up, but he stayed anyway. And that's when he saw her. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic soundtrack or slow-motion blur. His eyes just scanned the crowded corner table, caught something familiar in the curve of a shoulder, and snapped back before his brain could even process the hit. Blonde hair, long. The kind of gold that catches the light and holds onto it. She was standing by the pickup counter with her back to him, shifting a diaper bag and adjusting her grip on the tiny human pressed against her chest. A baby, maybe a year old, wearing a white onesie with little strawberries on it and 2 small bows pinned into her brown hair. The girl had her fists balled up in the woman's collar, totally unfazed by the clatter of the cafe. Ethan froze. The line shuffled forward and someone bumped his shoulder with a half-hearted sorry, but he didn't even feel it. His brain was redlining, stuttering over a detail he couldn't ignore, that hair. It was a specific, warm chestnut brown, the exact same shade Ethan saw in the mirror every single morning. He hadn't seen her eyes yet, but deep down he already knew. When the woman finally turned to check on the baby, Ethan felt a physical jolt in his chest that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just shock, it was something older. Chloe. She looked exactly the same, yet completely different. The way people do when they've been through a fire that changed them without leaving a scar. That same softness was in her eyes when she looked at the child, but there was a new steadiness there too. She looked like someone who had found her footing on a completely different planet. The baby turned her head, caught by the noise of the crowd, and looked directly at Ethan with 2 enormous, piercing blue eyes. And just like that, the air left his lungs. She saw him first. There's this split second right before someone notices you, a tiny window of time where you still have a choice. You can duck into a hallway, turn your back, or just vanish into the crowd. It's that frantic fight or flight moment where your brain tries to outrun reality. That's the thing nobody tells you about chance encounters. Sometimes fate gives you a 2-second warning. It's just long enough to register what's happening, but never long enough to actually do anything about it. Chloe spotted him in line before he even looked up, and for one heartbeat, every cell in her body screamed the same word: run. Maeve chose that exact moment to grab a fistful of Chloe's hair and yank. Honestly, if it wasn't for those tiny, sticky fingers anchoring her to the spot, she probably would have bolted. She winced, gently untangled the grip, and pressed a quick kiss to the top of her daughter's head. By the time she looked back up, the window had closed. His eyes found her. She watched the recognition hit him in waves. It's that specific look the brain gets when it refuses to believe what the eyes are already seeing. First, his face went totally still. Then, something shifted behind his expression. Something raw that she couldn't quite name and definitely didn't want to deal with. She hadn't practiced for this. Sure, she'd played out this scene 1,000 times over the last 2 years. You don't spend 3 years building a life with someone, watch it shatter in a hotel hallway, and then spend 14 months raising the living proof of that love without imagining the what if. She had pictured a version of herself that was cool, polished, and totally over it. But standing there in a crowded Starbucks, she was anything but fine. Chloe. His voice was lower than she remembered, or maybe she'd just done a really good job of convincing herself she'd forgotten the sound of it. She lifted her chin and shifted Mavie to her other hip, squaring her shoulders like she was stepping into a ring. Ethan. 2 years of silence, compressed into 2 names and a gap between them wide enough to swallow everything they used to be. He stepped out of the line. She didn't back up, but her entire body braced for impact. He looked exactly the same, which felt almost like an insult. He still had that sharp jaw and those green eyes that always seemed to see too much. He carried himself like the room had been built specifically for him, looking even more composed than she remembered. And it killed her, just a little bit, that she still noticed how good he looked. Mavie made a small sound, a mix between a hum and a question, and turned to stare at the man walking toward them. She watched him with that unfiltered curiosity only babies have, head tilted, completely unafraid of the stranger. Ethan's eyes dropped to the little girl. The cafe kept moving around them. Orders were called out, milk hissed in the steamer, and chairs scraped against the floor. The world just kept doing its indifferent thing, while something massive unfolded in the 12 inches of space between Chloe Anderson and the man she'd spent 2 years trying to erase. He looked at the baby for a long, heavy moment. Then he looked back at Chloe. "What's her name?" The question landed softly, almost carefully. It was the kind of question that felt like a tripwire, like he already suspected the answer was about to change his life forever. Chloe's grip on Mavie tightened. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, "Mavie." The name came out quieter than Chloe intended, almost like a secret she wasn't ready to give up. Ethan repeated it under his breath, testing the weight of the syllables. Mavie. His eyes moved back to the baby. Slowly this time, methodically, the same way he'd scan a high-stakes contract before signing his life away. He was looking for the fine print. Brown hair, blue eyes, a nose that was all Chloe, but a jawline that was... Don't. Chloe could practically see the gears turning behind his eyes. She felt that primal urge to just grab Mavie and bolt out the door before he could finish the math. "How old is she?" "Ethan." "How old, Chloe?" It wasn't aggressive, it was just precise. It was that CEO voice he used when he already knew the answer and was just giving you a chance to be honest before he laid his cards on the table. She swallowed hard. 1, a little over. 1 year and 4 months. She watched his face and saw the exact second the numbers clicked into place. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't look away from Mavie. Not for a second. "I need to go," Chloe said. Her voice stayed steady. She was actually proud of that, but her hands were starting to shake. Mavie felt it too. The little girl leaned her head against Chloe's collarbone, sensing that the air in the room had suddenly changed. "Wait. Ethan, please." That one word stopped her cold. In 3 years of living together, she could count on one hand the number of times he'd said please and actually meant it. There was a rawness in his voice she'd never heard before. Maybe it was there all along and she just missed it, or maybe the world had finally found a way to crack him open. She stayed. She didn't even know why, but she couldn't move. The cafe hummed on around them, totally oblivious to the fact that a life was being dismantled next to the sugar stirrers. Is she mine? Think about that for a second. Can you even imagine carrying a secret that heavy? All the late-night fevers, the first steps, the sheer exhaustion, and doing it all completely solo for over a year. Just you and a silent "what if" hanging over every diaper change. Chloe said nothing. In that silence, 2 years just collapsed. She was back in her apartment at 11:00 p.m., staring at a plastic stick on the bathroom sink. She remembered her thumb hovering over his name in her contacts for 45 minutes, before she finally locked her phone and put it face down. She remembered that hotel hallway, Catherine's hands on his lapels, the way his head was bent down, the way neither of them pulled away. She had chosen silence like a locked door, and she still wasn't sure if it was the right choice. But she'd made it. For 14 months, it had just been the two of them figuring it out. The sleepless nights, the grocery runs, the small miracle-level stuff of watching a person become a person. She hadn't needed him. She'd told herself that so many times it had almost started to feel like the truth. Chloe. His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. She looked at him, and she didn't say a word. Let me tell you what those 2 years actually looked like. I'm not talking about the social media version where she was some pillar of strength who was totally at peace. I'm talking about the real version, the one that happens when the lights are off and the house is quiet. There is a very specific kind of weight that comes with building something monumental entirely on your own. Whether you're launching a dream business or, in Chloe's case, literally growing a human being, there's no one to high-five when things go right and no one to lean on when it all feels like it's collapsing. It's rewarding, sure, but let's be real. It's also lonely as hell. It was a Tuesday in November, about 2 years and 3 months ago, when Chloe was driving home from a school conference. She stopped at a pharmacy for some ibuprofen and picked up a pregnancy test almost as an afterthought. She was 11 days late, but she'd convinced herself it was just stress. Her life had been nothing but stress since the night her world ended. The test took 3 minutes. She sat on that cold bathroom floor for 2 hours after. Ethan's name was still in her phone. She hadn't deleted the contact, but she hadn't touched it either. She actually typed out, "I need to tell you something," and stared at the screen until the letters started to blur. Then she hit delete and shoved the phone face down on the tile. Her brain just kept looping back to that hotel hallway. He kissed Catherine. His hands were on her face. She'd watched the whole thing play out from 20 feet away like a slow-motion car crash. And the worst part was, he never even knew she was there. She figured it had probably been going on for a while. It usually is. Chloe had decided right then and there that she wasn't going to be the woman who begs for an explanation she already has. So, she built a life in the space where he used to be. She told her mother the relationship ended because of distance, geographic, emotional, whatever. She wasn't lying. She just left out the part that was currently making her nauseous every morning. She bought a second-hand crib in March and spent a weekend painting it white with the windows wide open. She leaned into her teacher instincts and read every single book on infant development she could get her hands on. She made lists. She cried a lot. She started running at dawn because it was the only way to move her body without her mind spiraling back to him. Maevie was born on a Thursday in June at 6:47 a.m. When Chloe held her for the first time, she just whispered a quiet, "Hi," like they were being introduced at a party. Maevie scrunched her face and screamed at the cold air, and Chloe laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Then she saw the hair, that specific warm chestnut brown. It pulled something sideways in Chloe's chest, but she pushed it down. She told herself it didn't matter. All that mattered was the little girl who had no idea her father was a ghost. All she needed was a mother who showed up. And Chloe showed up every single day. But what Chloe didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly guessed, was that the kiss she'd seen wasn't an accident. Catherine Ross had engineered the whole thing. The problem that brought her to Ethan's hotel room, the timing, the proximity, it was all a setup. Catherine knew exactly where Chloe would be standing. See, Catherine wasn't just an ex. She was a master architect of chaos, and she had bet everything on the hope that Chloe would walk away and take her secrets with her. He called her the next morning. She almost didn't pick up. She was standing in the kitchen, prepping Maevie's breakfast, oatmeal with mashed banana, which Maevie was currently attacking with the kind of pure, messy enthusiasm only a toddler can muster. Chloe watched his name flash on the screen, and her hand just hovered there for 4 long rings. She finally picked up on the 5th. "I want a paternity test," Ethan said. "No hello, no small talk. Not because I doubt you, Chloe, but because I need this to be real in a way I can actually hold on to." Men are wired a little differently when it comes to this stuff, aren't they? For a mom, the reality is there from the first morning sickness to the first kick. But for the guys, sometimes they need that piece of paper, that cold, hard proof. Not because they're being jerks, but because their brains are trying to bridge the gap between this is impossible and this is my daughter. Chloe set the spoon down. She'd been bracing for this, and she had a whole mountain of righteous anger ready to go. She'd practiced the speeches and organized her defense. But she wasn't ready for that specific tone in his voice. I need it to be real in a way I can hold. That wasn't the voice of a man looking for an exit strategy. It was the sound of someone trying to walk toward a miracle on very shaky ground. Fine, she said. They met at the clinic on Friday afternoon. Chloe showed up with Mavie in the carrier, the one with the faded elephant pattern she'd scored on clearance. Ethan was already there, leaning against the entrance in a sharp charcoal coat, staring at the street with that boardroom mask he used when he was dying inside. The second he saw Mavie, he went dead still. Inside, the clinic was all white walls and efficiency. A cheerful technician took the swabs and promised results within 72 hours. Chloe kept her focus entirely on Mavie, fiddling with the carrier straps, humming under her breath, doing anything to avoid looking at the man standing 3 feet away. Afterward, out in the parking lot, Ethan dropped down to a crouch to get on Mavie's level. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. Mavie stared back with that intense baby concentration, tilting her head like she was solving a puzzle. She wasn't scared at all. Then, she reached out and wrapped her tiny hand around his index finger. It was just a reflex. Babies do that to literally anything within reach. But the way Ethan's face changed was something Chloe wasn't prepared for. That composed billionaire mask didn't just crack. It felt like it was dissolving right in front of her. You could see his pulse in his throat as he struggled to keep it together. He let Mavie hold his finger for a full minute, just standing there in the middle of a parking lot. Chloe had to look away. You can let go now, she said finally, keeping her voice as flat as possible. He looked up at her, his eyes wider than she'd ever seen them. I know. But he didn't let go. They just stood there in the wind, Chloe's hair blowing across her face, while their daughter held onto a stranger like she'd been waiting for him her entire life. The call came at 11:08 on a Wednesday night. Chloe was still wide awake. Mavie had been fussy since 8. That specific, restless grunting that comes with new teeth. And she'd finally gotten her down 20 minutes ago. Now Chloe was just sitting on the couch in the dark, too exhausted to move but too wired to actually sleep. When his name flashed on the screen, her heart did something sharp and involuntary, like a physical jolt she couldn't ignore. She picked up. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Ethan? More silence. She could actually hear him breathing, which was jarring because Ethan Walker was not the kind of man who let you hear him breathe. He was the guy who controlled every room, every breath, every heartbeat. I have a daughter. His voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth, landing like something heavy dropped from a great height. Chloe pressed her lips together, her throat tight. She's 1 year and 4 months old. He paused, and she could hear the gears grinding. I missed. I wasn't there for. He stopped, started again. Chloe. The way he said her name cracked something open that she had spent a very long time sealing shut with industrial-grade pride. Don't, she said softly. I'm not asking you to. He exhaled, a ragged sound. I need a second. There's something incredibly disarming about watching, or in this case hearing, a strong man completely fall apart. It doesn't matter how much you might resent them or how much they hurt you. When that armor finally shatters and you realize they're just as lost as you are, it hits you in a place you didn't think was still vulnerable. She gave him that second. And then she heard it, a sound she hadn't heard from him in the 3 years they were together. It was jagged and honest. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with boardrooms, acquisitions, or the curated control of the Ethan Walker brand. He was crying. It was a quiet, muffled kind of sobbing, the kind that's almost worse because he was clearly trying to keep the door shut but just couldn't latch it. Chloe sat in her dark living room, listening to the father of her child break down over a cell signal. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth, staring at the baby monitor where Mavie's breathing moved in small rhythmic waves. She wanted to feel something, comfort, anger, maybe even a little bit of triumph, but she couldn't afford to let the wall down yet. "Get some sleep," she said finally. Her voice was gentler than she intended. He didn't answer. She ended the call and sat in the silence for a long, long time. What Chloe didn't know was that 40 minutes later, a key turned in the lock of Ethan's 31st floor apartment. Catherine Ross walked in with a bottle of wine, and that practiced "everything is fine" smile she'd been perfecting on the drive over. He just left her standing there at the door. Have you ever noticed how some people have a sixth sense for when you're at your absolute breaking point? It's rarely an accident. There are people who don't show up to help you up. They show up because they know that's when you're the easiest to steer. It's not support. It's a calculated move. Catherine hadn't seen this coming. For the last 5 years, she'd made a career out of reading Ethan Walker like a high-stakes contract. She'd rehearsed a version of this night where the news about the baby would rattle him just enough that he'd need a shoulder to lean on, and she'd be right there to provide it. Instead, he looked at her like she was a bug under a microscope, a problem he'd already solved and moved past. "How long have you known?" he asked. The wine bottle was still in her hand. She set it down on the entryway table with a forced, measured calm. "Known what exactly?" "Catherine, don't." She caught the tone, that flat, dead-end register that meant the alternative facts weren't going to work tonight. So she did what she always did when a play failed. She cut her losses and went for the jugular. "Since before she left," she said. Ethan just nodded slowly. His expression had gone quiet and terrifyingly cold. It wasn't even anger anymore. This was way worse. This was the version of Ethan that files you away under trash and never looks back. "The night in the hotel," he said. It wasn't a question. "You were never going to choose me, Ethan," she snapped, the mask finally slipping. "You've been in love with her since the 3rd month, I saw it. So I adjusted the variables. I planned accordingly. Like Chloe's 2 years of silence and 14 months of solo parenting were just acceptable losses in a business projection. Like a human life was just a line item she could cross out." Ethan looked at her for what felt like an eternity. Then he said, "Leave." It wasn't loud. His voice wasn't even shaking. The word had the absolute finality of a signed death warrant. Catherine, the woman who could dismantle a judge with a single sentence, felt the sharp, stinging humiliation of realizing she finally had 0 moves left on the board. She left. Ethan stood in his empty apartment for 11 minutes. Then he grabbed his coat. The drive to Chloe's place took 18 minutes. He parked across the street and stared up at her window on the 3rd floor. He recognized the small potted plant on the ledge, a succulent she'd named Gerald back when they were together. Seeing that plant still alive felt like a punch to the gut. It was a tiny green reminder of the life he should have been part of. He had no speech, no plan, no excuses. He went up anyway. 11:47 p.m. She heard the knock and knew immediately. You know that feeling when your body registers a threat or a ghost before your brain even catches up? She knew exactly who was on the other side of that door. She didn't move from the couch. He knocked again, 3 times. Slow, steady, not demanding at all. There was a patience in it that rattled her more than if he'd been pounding on the wood. "Chloe." His voice was muffled, but in the silence of the apartment it sounded like he was standing right next to her. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I need you to hear something." She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. She stayed silent. "I know you saw the hotel." A heavy beat of silence followed. "I didn't know you were there." "Chloe, I spent 2 years wondering why you just vanished. I spent every day thinking it was something I did, which I know sounds convenient now, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't fix what I couldn't see." She pressed her back harder against the cushions, trying to keep the walls of her life from caving in. "She set it up?" he said. "Catherine, the whole thing. She knew exactly where you'd be standing. Look, I don't expect you to believe me tonight. I don't even expect you to open this door. He stopped. She heard him exhale slowly, That specific, jagged sigh he'd always give when he was searching for the right word. I just couldn't let another night go by with you thinking that what you saw was what I wanted. The apartment was deathly still. On the baby monitor, she could hear the soft, rhythmic puff of Mavy's breathing. I want you to really put yourself in her shoes for a second. You've spent 2 years building a fortress around your heart to survive. You've turned your anger into a weapon just to stay upright. Now the person who broke it all is 3 inches of wood away, sounding like he's bleeding out. How long do you stay on your side of the door before you break? Chloe stared into the dark and felt the careful architecture of her life start to shift and groan under its own weight. It was so much easier to be strong when she didn't have to hear his voice. Duh. The tiny voice came through the monitor, half word, half question. It was the sound Mavy made when she woke up in the middle of the night just to make sure the world was still there. Chloe's breath hitched. She stood up. She walked to the door and put her hand on the cold metal handle, standing there for 5 seconds while every no she'd ever rehearsed died in her throat. She opened it. He looked like the night had chewed him up and spit him out. He was still in that charcoal coat, collar turned up against the hallway draft, and those green eyes of his locked onto her face like a drowning man finding a shoreline. Neither of them said a word. She woke up, Chloe said finally. It was a flimsy excuse, a way to explain away the fact that she'd actually opened the door. Yeah, Ethan said, and the way he said it made it clear he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. He sat on the couch while she got Mavy back to sleep. When she came back, she found him exactly where she'd left him. He hadn't moved an inch. His hands were loose in his lap, and he was staring at the small framed photos on the shelf across the room. There was Mavy at 2 months, a messy finger-painting project from Chloe's classroom, and a picture of Chloe's mom from last Christmas. Just ordinary, everyday snapshots. But to him, they were the high-definition texture of a life he'd been completely erased from. It's one thing to know you missed out. It's another to see the physical proof staring back at you from a bookshelf. Chloe sat in the armchair across from him. She tucked her feet under her, wrapped her cardigan tight like a shield, and looked at the man she had loved, grieved, and resented in equal measure for 700 days. She just waited. "Tell me," she said. So he did. He told her about the conference, about Catherine showing up out of thin air. He described that fraction of a second where Catherine had grabbed his face. It wasn't a mutual kiss. It was a staged, calculated performance for an audience of one. He told her how he'd pulled back in under 2 seconds, confused and annoyed, and how he'd tried to call Chloe 3 times the next morning because he felt the shift in the air. But she'd already blocked his number by then. Chloe listened to the whole thing without jumping in, which was harder than it sounds. She had 2 years of unspoken words stacked up behind her teeth like a dam about to burst. When he finally finished, the silence stretched between them. "I believe you," she said. She saw his shoulders drop just a fraction of an inch. "But that doesn't fix it," she added. "I know. You don't just get to—" She stopped and pressed her fingers to her forehead, trying to catch her breath. "I sat in that hospital room by myself, Ethan. I picked her name by myself. I had nobody to call at 3 in the morning when she wouldn't stop crying, and I was so exhausted I couldn't even think straight. Her voice didn't break, but it bent under the weight of the memory. An explanation doesn't just repair that. Let's be real for a second. Forgiving someone isn't the same thing as forgetting what they put you through. You can move past the lie, but you can't just delete the struggle. For every woman who's had to be her own hero while the person who should have been there was MIA, you know that an apology is just a start. It's not the finish line." "I'm not asking you to repair it," he said. "I'm asking if I can show up." She looked at him, searching for the catch. "For her," he clarified. Then, with a level of honesty she hadn't expected, "And eventually, if you let me, for you too." Chloe studied his face. She'd learned the hard way how to read what was actually happening beneath that polished corporate surface. "You can see her," she said finally. "We figure the rest out one step at a time. No pressure, no promises, and absolutely no pretending." He nodded, the relief visible in his eyes. "And Ethan?" She locked onto his gaze. Catherine is done, with both of us. That is not negotiable. Already handled. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He finally left at 1:30 in the morning. Chloe locked the door and stood in her quiet apartment, listening to Mavie's steady breathing through the monitor. For just a moment, in the privacy of the dark, she allowed herself to feel something small, cautious, and completely terrifying. She felt hope, but she didn't know, not yet, that Catherine wasn't the type to just walk away quietly. The message hit the school's anonymous feedback system on a Thursday morning. Chloe's principal, Dr. Mercer, called her into the office with that specific diplomatic neutrality administrators use when they smell smoke, but haven't found the fire yet. An anonymous report. Concerns about professional conduct. It was detailed, way too detailed for a random tip. Chloe sat across from the desk and listened to the accusations with a cold stillness. She recognized the shape of this attack before she even knew the source. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hit job. The timing was too surgical, the details too intimate. She drove home afterward and just sat in her car for 15 minutes. She wasn't crying. She was well past that. At this point, she couldn't tell if that was personal growth or just permanent damage. Then, she called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. "I know," he said, before she could even get a word out. Silence. "What do you mean, you know?" "I found out yesterday afternoon. I've had someone keeping an eye on her since. Look, I know how that sounds, but you already handled it. I went to Dr. Mercer this morning before the first bell. I brought documentation. The whole thing should be cleared by the end of the week. There's a massive difference between a guy who shows up only when it's convenient and a man who steps into the line of fire before you even have to ask. It's not about being a damsel in distress. Chloe has proven she can handle herself. It's about finally having someone in your corner who actually stays awake so you can finally get some sleep. That's real protection." Chloe stared through the windshield at her apartment building. "You didn't even tell me you were going to do that, Ethan. I didn't want to freak you out if it turned out to be nothing." "Ethan." Her voice sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "I've been fighting my own battles for 2 years. You can't just swoop in and—" "I know that." His voice was quiet, steady. "I know you can do it all. I'm not saying you're incapable." A beat of silence. "I'm just saying you don't have to anymore if you don't want to." She closed her eyes, letting that sink in. Through the phone, she could hear the background noise of Chicago, a distant siren, the wind, that specific city hum that doesn't care about your problems. "We need to talk," she said. "I know. In person. Tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring coffee." She actually laughed, a real, genuine laugh that caught her by surprise. "You hate Starbucks, Ethan." "I don't hate it. You called it aggressively mediocre. I said the lines were too long." She could hear the shift in his voice, that old warmth from a different lifetime. "I think I can manage." She hung up, sat there for one more minute, and then went upstairs to be with her daughter. He showed up at 8:15 sharp with 2 cups of coffee and a small coffee cake that Mavie immediately tried to deconstruct like a structural engineer. Chloe sat across from him at her small kitchen table, the one she'd found at a garage sale and painted a soft, pale blue the summer before Mavie was born. She watched him just let it happen. He sat there while a 1-year-old picked apart pieces of cake with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for a moon landing. He was actually good with her. That was the part Chloe wasn't prepared for. This was Ethan Walker, the man who ran quarterly reviews with the same cold energy generals used to run military campaigns. And here he was, sitting at a thrift store table, letting a toddler smear crumbs all over his expensive sleeve. And the craziest part? He looked completely, genuinely fine with it. There are some things in this world you just can't fake. You can't fake the way a man looks at a child he's falling in love with. It's in the softening of the jaw, the way the boss persona just evaporates. Have you ever seen that shift happen in real time? It's like watching a completely different person wake up inside them. I found out about that report on Wednesday, he said, his eyes never leaving Mavie. I went in Thursday morning. You should have told me, Ethan. Probably. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze. I was just trying to fix it before it had a chance to scare you. I'm not someone who needs to be protected from the world. I know that. He held her eyes steadily, not backing down. I wasn't trying to protect you from the problem itself. I was just trying to be useful. There's a difference, Chloe. I'm still learning what that looks like. Chloe looked at him, really looked, and felt her internal defenses run a quiet structural check on themselves. She had built those walls for a reason. She'd laid every single stone with her own hands in the middle of those long, dark months. She wasn't ready to tear them down yet. Maybe she wouldn't be for a long time. But she realized she could, at least, leave a door unlocked. You've been showing up every single day for 3 weeks, she said. Yes. For Mavie. For Mavie, he confirmed. Then, with a raw honesty that caught her off guard, and because I want to be the kind of man who earns the right to show up for you too. I'm not asking for that today. I just want you to know that's the direction I'm headed. Mavie reached up and planted both hands on Ethan's face with the casual authority of someone who had decided this human was now her personal property. Chloe watched him laugh, a real surprised laugh that she used to know by heart. The kitchen was small and warm, flooded with that perfect morning light. She looks exactly like you, Chloe whispered. She has your eyes, though. She has your everything else. He looked down at Mavie, who was now inspecting his ear with professional curiosity, and an expression crossed his face that Chloe felt right in the center of her chest. It was the kind of look that bypasses every bit of armor you've ever built. Hey, she said it gently. He looked up. I see you, she said. I'm not saying yes to everything, not yet, but I see what you're doing. It wasn't total forgiveness, it wasn't officially a beginning, but it was the first honest thing she'd said about the thaw happening inside her. She watched him take it in like a man who had finally learned not to ask for more than what was offered. Outside, Chicago was doing its Wednesday thing, relentless, unimpressed, and loud. And then the intercom buzzed, and just like that, the peace was gone. It was Catherine. Of course it was. She stood at the building's entrance, staring up at the security camera with a look that had finally shed every last bit of strategy. As Chloe looked at the intercom screen, she realized this wasn't another play. This was a woman who had finally run out of moves and just needed in some raw and ugly way to be seen in her defeat. Ethan was already on his feet, his jaw set. Don't, Chloe said. He looked at her, surprised. I mean, let me. She handed him Mavie, who accepted the handoff with her usual go-with-the-flow attitude, and she buzzed the door open. There is a massive power shift that happens when a woman stops needing someone else to fight her battles. It's not because she's suddenly soft or giving up. It's because she's finally whole enough to stand in the fire herself. She didn't need a protector anymore. She needed a witness. Catherine walked up the stairs. She stopped in the apartment doorway, her eyes darting from Chloe to Ethan. He was standing there holding a child who looked exactly like him, with an ease that proved every single thing Catherine had spent 2 years trying to sabotage had already happened. Looking at her now, she didn't look like the polished shark who had manufactured that hotel crisis. She just looked exhausted. I'm not here to... She started, then stopped, searching for the right frequency. I wanted to say it to your face. Chloe just waited. I knew she existed. Catherine's voice was flat, totally emptied of the usual performance. His daughter, I knew from the very beginning. I had a contact at the clinic where he did the test. I could have told him. She paused, the weight of the confession hanging in the air. I chose not to. The apartment went dead quiet. Mavie, completely oblivious to the fact that her life was being discussed, was busy pulling on Ethan's collar with a look of extreme focus. I know that doesn't... Catherine exhaled. It doesn't change anything, I just... She looked at Chloe directly, and for the first time there was no subtext. No hidden agenda. You deserved better than what I did. Chloe studied her for a long, heavy moment. Yes, Chloe said. I did. Catherine nodded once. She looked at Ethan one last time. His eyes were steady and offered her absolutely nothing, which was the final answer she needed. Then she turned and left. They heard her footsteps on the stairs, the heavy thud of the lobby door, and then nothing. Chloe stood in her doorway and finally let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 years. You okay? Ethan asked. She turned around. There he was, in her cramped apartment with her thrifted blue table and Mavy's toys scattered across the floor, holding their daughter and watching her with zero calculation in his eyes. I'm getting there, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to him, and for right now, it was enough. 3 weeks later, Ethan moved into an apartment just 4 blocks away. It was close enough to be present, but far enough to let Chloe set the pace. He showed up every single morning at 8:15 with 2 coffees. He learned which drawer held the bibs, exactly how Mavy liked her oatmeal, and the precise minute she needed her nap. He showed up for school events, for bedtimes, and for one spectacularly chaotic Tuesday involving a rubber duck and an entire bottle of baby shampoo. He didn't demand more than what she offered. He didn't try to buy his way back in or fast-track the forgiveness. He just did the work. He learned, slowly and without any fanfare, how to stay. 1 year. Chicago in the autumn is a completely different city than the one where this all started. It's colder, quieter, and the lake turns this deep gray-green that feels more honest than the summer light ever does. The trees along the lakefront are exploding in orange and gold, and there's a little girl in a red coat running ahead of her parents. She moves with the absolute confidence of someone who has never even considered the possibility of falling. Mavy hits the terrible 2s in a couple of months. She already has very strong opinions about her shoes, a vocabulary of about 40 words, and a deep emotional attachment to a stuffed elephant named Gerald. Chloe has a feeling that name is going to make a lot more sense to her in retrospect. There is something almost miraculous about watching a family that nearly didn't exist become real. To see 2 people who were once separated by a mountain of secrets in a hotel hallway, finally standing on the same patch of earth. It's a reminder that sometimes, the things we think are permanently broken are just waiting for enough time and enough work to grow back stronger. They're walking the lakefront path on a Sunday morning, just the 3 of them, with no real destination and zero urgency. That was actually the hardest thing for Ethan to learn in this new life. How to just be without a goal or a deadline. He walks with his hands in his pockets, watching Mavy navigate a pile of leaves like a tiny scientist on a mission. Every few feet she finds a treasure, a stick, a smooth stone, some unidentifiable piece of Chicago debris, and she sprints back to show him. He actually crouches down, looks at the leaf with total seriousness, and gives her his professional assessment. Mavy just beams, satisfied that her hard work is being properly recognized by the big guy. Chloe walks right beside him, so close their arms are almost touching. She's been watching him for a year now, not with that old sharp suspicion. That chapter closed slowly at first, then all at once. Now she watches him the way you watch someone finally become themselves. It's a mix of deep attention and something much bigger than just gratitude. She lets her arm press against his. He doesn't make a big deal out of it or try to turn it into a moment. He just subtly adjusts his pace to stay perfectly in sync with her. Chloe feels that tiny adjustment deep in her chest. Hey, she says softly. He looks over at her. I love you. She says it like it's the simplest thing in the world, because honestly, it finally is. I've been trying to find the perfect moment for about 4 months. I kept waiting for something big and cinematic, but it's just Sunday. We're just walking. And I love you. Ethan stops in his tracks. Chloe stops too. A few yards ahead, Mavy is hunched over something extraordinary in the grass. He looks at her with those steady green eyes. The look she now knows means he's not performing or managing anything, he's just there. I know, he says. Oh, you know. I've known for 3 months. A tiny smile tugs at the corner of his mouth. I was just waiting for you to be ready to say it. Chloe laughs, a real, head-tilted back laugh at the gray Chicago sky. God, you are insufferable. Probably. She shakes her head, smiling. Then, he reaches out and takes her hand. She lets him. They stand there on the path while their daughter marches toward them carrying a stick, a rock, and the mangled remains of a leaf like their sacred offerings. Maeve is completely unbothered by the heavy emotional shift that just happened. She's perfectly at home in the only world she's ever known, the one where her parents are together. The morning is long and everything is finally fine. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been in Chloe's shoes, if you had watched the person you loved through a hotel window and walked away with a secret that changed your entire universe, what would you have done? Would you have stayed and demanded the truth right then? Or would you have made that same silent choice to walk away? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this story hit home for you, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and come back next week. I've got another story waiting for you, and I promise it's going to hit just as hard. See you then. The end.